Thank you very much, Janice, for that lovely introduction. I'm really excited about this session. I think all the papers fit really well together thematically, and I'm really looking forward to the other two presentations. So my paper today introduces my preliminary research on Grenfell hooked rugs produced during the early 20th century. For my focus today, I will look at these cultural objects in relation to the role of female crafter and occupational therapist Jessie Luther and her work with the Grenfell Mission in rural Newfoundland and Labrador communities. Grenfell hooked rugs remain valued as art pieces, craft objects, and cultural souvenirs in contemporary private and museum collections in Canada and the US, each Grenfell object marked with a label designed by Luther. Luther, however, did not invent the style of hooked rugs that became associated with her and the 20th century mission organized by Dr. Wilfred Grenfell to help impoverished communities in northern Newfoundland and Labrador. Hooked rugs have been produced in Newfoundland since being introduced by Scottish and English sailors and fishermen in the early 1800s. Traditionally, hooked mats from Newfoundland were known for their bold use of color and geometrics, such as the mats made from a random mix of colors known as scrappy or hiddenness. Hooked rugs made from scraps of old clothing were generally dark in color, although light-colored rugs were prized for their scarcity and saved for special mats. These types of textiles were originally considered a chore of poverty, often made by women to cover exposed wooden floorboards, often no more than bare boards. So I have a brief caveat that I'm going to offer here about the images, which is that early examples of Newfoundland hooked rugs are extremely difficult and they're hard to come by. So the images I have to show you today is one such as this that shows the wear and tear of the rug. This would have been a large rug that would be used as a floor covering in a house, or some of them are remakes, often done by the Rug Hooking Guild of Newfoundland and Labrador with different colored textures but using the same colors and designs. So I don't have a lot of images of actually pre-Grenfell rugs. And while I do have some images of Grenfell hooked rugs produced under the direction of Luther, my research is still in the very, very early stages, and the majority of images I'm showing are taken from only two collections, the Rug Hooking Guild of Newfoundland and Labrador and Grenfell Properties Management. So at this stage of the research, I'm still beginning the process of gathering material evidence and beginning more object analysis. And so my purposes here today, the examples I show function more as illustrations to give you a sense of the type of objects I'm talking about, rather than points of in-depth analysis. Caveat out of the way for images. In 1906, during the first mission to the headquarters of the International Grenfell Association in St. Anthony on the northern peninsula of Newfoundland, Luther immediately saw the traditional hooked rugs as the basis of a viable industry that could be marketed internationally. As she wrote in her journal during this summer 1906 visit, quote, "I know of no work of the kind found anywhere to compare to the excellence of the workmanship of the mats, many of which resemble tapestry. It is difficult to make purchasers believe they are hooked. The work is so fine and even," end quote. While Luther believed the handiwork itself was skillful, she also believed that the designs and color schemes had to be altered in order to provide an aesthetically pleasing and economically valuable object. With the hooked rugs, Luther believed she could build upon the local skill set of women's weaving, but help to modernize and market the rugs through providing new designs and color combinations that would appeal to middle-class consumers. For Luther, however, the rugs represented not only the potential to solve economic ills of impoverished communities, but also to cure social, physical, and mental problems associated with the lower classes in rural areas. As I will discuss in this paper, the hooked rugs offered both a process and a product that could provide cultural and economic uplift. In this way, Luther's efforts with the Grenfell Mission applied ideas drawn from arts and crafts revivalism and early occupational therapy to use material cultural objects to reform individuals and communities judged by Luther to be impoverished on a number of levels. The production and circulation of Grenfell hooked rugs made in the early 20th century under Luther's design and direction then operate in the intersection of gender, class, and craft relations, along with many others that I'm not going to necessarily discuss here. Gender, class, and craft will kind of be a focal point of this, but I acknowledge that there are many other social categories that could be brought into this analysis. In this paper, I outline my preliminary research on the history of Grenfell hooked rugs and the way in which Luther encouraged their production and sale as the antidote to social, physical, mental, and economic ills. By interweaving social history and material culture, I address the rugs in relation to Luther's aims as an occupational therapist, a trade that enabled women to work within the medical profession, and her interest in arts and crafts revivalism in order to create programs and products that would benefit the individual and the collective in rural communities in early 20th century northern Newfoundland and Labrador. However, before I delve further into this case study of Jessie Luther and Grenfell hooked rugs, I would like to situate the framework for this research within a larger collaborative project in which I am involved. Along with two colleagues at the University of New Brunswick, Erin Morton and Sasha Mullally, Erin Morton, who is actually here today, I am developing a project that examines the way in which two areas of social reform, occupational therapy and arts and crafts revivalism, emerged and intersected in 20th century North America. Titled, The Social Fabric of Healing in 20th Century Northeastern North America, this project uses 3 case studies as entry points to examine how women could deploy material objects for the purposes of social welfare. Each of these case studies centers on a female healthcare practitioner and weaver whose cultural production intersected with arts and crafts revivalist movements. While I focus on Luther's practices with the Grenfell Mission in rural Newfoundland and Labrador, Morton examines Mary Black's work with the Handicrafts and Home Industries Division in Nova Scotia, and Mullally looks at Mary Dole's activities with the Deerfield Society of Blue and White Needlework in Massachusetts. Each of these examples, Luther, Black, and Dole, utilizes the practices of occupational therapy with arts and crafts revivalism to establish a context for what we have labeled in our project therapeutic craft making. Drawing strength from other social activists and political reform movements, therapeutic craft offered women newfound opportunities to enter into medical practice and to have economic independence. We situate our concept of therapeutic craft within the larger trend of educated liberal white women taking on the role of helping sick and marginalized groups as an extension of their domestic duties in the late 19th and 20th centuries. As Mary Ryan suggests, these women-run organizations served to reform individuals and institutions and enabled women to move into the public sphere as social housekeepers, thus challenging previous generations' dominant ideas of separate spheres and true womanhood. Such opportunities for women working in healthcare and craft then occurred in part because therapeutic craft was believed to unite the space of the home with the space of social reform. The expansion of women's roles in healing and healthcare practices opened up opportunities for a new respectable profession for middle-class women. With this research project, Morton, Mullally, and I seek to conduct interdisciplinary collaborative research through a new analytical approach that is situated at the intersection of 2 academic fields, the social history of healthcare and material cultural studies. For my focus, I believe Luther, her history and her work, internal and external to the Grenfell Mission, exemplify the practices of therapeutic craft through the amalgamation of healthcare and craft ideas. Born in Providence, Rhode Island in 1860 to a prominent middle-class family, Luther began private instruction in visual art at the age of 10. At 19, she entered the Rhode Island School of Design for drawing and painting, but left after a year to pursue watercolor training at the Studio, a small art school run by Mary C. Wheeler, who believed in the communitarian environment for artistic production. In 1890, at the age of 30, Luther traveled to Paris to further her artistic training in painting, and upon returning to the United States 4 years later in 1894, took up a position teaching art at the College for Women in Columbia, South Carolina. By 1899, Luther had moved back to Providence, where she taught art and design and continued her own craft training, such as studying basket weaving with weavers in Deerfield, Massachusetts. Additionally, Luther was an active participant in arts and crafts societies in both Boston and Chicago. In an article published in House Beautiful, a forum for arts and crafts ideas, Luther explained her belief that handicraft could provide a personal and collective salve to the sicknesses caused by modernization. And I quote, "And now, in the midst of this mechanical age, when methods are constantly invented for substituting the machine for the hand, thereby forcing the hand simply to become part of the machine itself without thought, will, or ingenuity, there has come a reaction, a reversion to hand industry, to the work of the individual, with its interest in the work and opportunity for originality in color and design, and for the development and coordination of hand and brain. In 1901, Luther was invited by Jane Addams to participate in her live-work project at Chicago's Hull House, which was founded by Addams in 1889 as a space to provide social, artistic, and educational programs for working people. Hull House was established on the principles of early occupational therapy and arranged as a therapeutic settlement model of collective living, where practitioners such as Luther lived where they practiced in order to realize Addams' mission of neighbors helping neighbors. In 1903, after working for 2 years at Hull House, Luther was hospitalized in rural New Hampshire for exhaustion. During her hospitalization, Luther spent much of her time working on handicrafts, an activity to which she credited her recovery. During this recovery period, Luther met Herbert Hall, a general practitioner from Marblehead, Massachusetts. Although not a psychiatrist, Hall was preoccupied with the enervating effects of neurasthenia, a condition of depression and boredom, which was then regarded as one of the severe consequences of modern urban living. Challenging the widespread belief that a rest cure was a proper treatment for symptoms of neurasthenia, Hall and Luther began working together on a program that advocated occupation and activity to engage hands and mind. A year later, in 1904, Luther and Hall institutionalized their program for occupational therapy through craft training in a small sanatorium in Marblehead called the Handicraft Shop. The success of this program resulted in a succession of visiting physicians eager to observe these new medical practices, and it was through the Handicraft Shop that in 1905, Luther met Dr. Wilfred Grenfell and learned of his endeavors in rural Newfoundland and Labrador. Grenfell, a British doctor, had established the International Grenfell Association in 1899 to provide healthcare, education, religious services, and rehabilitation and social activities to northern Newfoundland fishermen and their families. Even before Luther's involvement, Grenfell had encouraged a local cottage industry and crafts. Inspired by the practical religion of self-reliance, he saw crafts as an opportunity to raise money for his mission and to provide local residents with a role in this work. For Luther, after an initial tour of the activities of the Grenfell mission at its base in St. Anthony and to several other coastal areas in 1906, she was impressed with the potential for developing craft industries and returned again to Newfoundland and Labrador in summer 1907 to set up the Grenfell Industrial Department, which was responsible she returned in the summer 1907 to set up the Grenfell Industrial Department, which was responsible for her providing handiwork training to local women as well as to men during the fishery off-season. Mat making and rug hooking in particular interested Luther because the region provided a base of women she already considered skilled in craftsmanship. However, while Luther was impressed with the fine skills of the local women, she was less impressed with the aesthetic properties of the final hooked product. Many of the original mats had designs of blocks, triangles, and floral patterns. According to her journal, Luther worried that the existing designs could not be marketed outside the local environment and that the colors would not match the interiors of contemporary middle-class households. Although not articulated specifically in her own writings, Luther also most likely felt that joy in labor and social and moral uplift, key principles of the international arts and crafts movement, and core to Luther's own philosophies of occupational therapy, could only occur through encouraging aesthetic pleasure in design. So I show you just kind of a broad spectrum of Grenfell hooked rugs, designed by Luther and carried out by the women in rural communities of Newfoundland and Labrador. Therefore, Luther offered a series of new designs of her own creation to the local rug hookers that consisted of a plain center and a border featuring images of seals, walruses, deer, rabbits, comatics, dogs, and people in winter dress, as well as maps, all of which were intended to show evidence of place, specifically rural Newfoundland and Labrador. While earlier mats were sized to cover the floor, Luther's own designs encouraged decorative products, particularly wall hangings. With the patterns marked or stenciled on burlap, which was used as the backing material for all the rugs, the mats were given to women to work with in their own homes. And just for gossipy fun purposes, in the top left-hand corner, the ice floes and the polar bears, all of these are taken from Grenfell Properties Management, which has a fairly large collection of rugs and sells them. That's for sale currently for $1,500. Just to get a sense of what we're talking about with price here today. Additionally, Luther encouraged the use of new colors produced by local plant-based dyes, which were in line with arts and crafts ideas of the handmade and the handcrafted, as a revolt against the ills of modernization, as well as the belief that natural dyes were more refined and pleasing to the eye than synthetic dyes. Most of the materials used in Grenfell hooked rugs under Luther's direction were dyed in the loom room at St. Anthony using vegetable dyes such as madder and indigo, fast colors, and experimental hues produced from spruce twigs mordanted with alum so as to yield a fast beige color. The women were also given copperas and lime to produce iron rust shades, and the patent bark powder used by fishermen to dye their sails. Under Luther's direction, the production and sale of what came to be known as Grenfell hooked rugs provided enough economic return so as to support the Grenfell Industrial Department. In 1910, Luther's involvement with the Grenfell mission diminished as she spent more time preparing an occupational therapy program at Butler Hospital in Providence, Rhode Island. By 1915, Luther was prepared to resign completely from the Grenfell mission, not least of all because of a serious disagreement she had with Grenfell, the specifics of which I've yet to uncover, but I definitely want to find out since gossiping. Luther's involvement in the Grenfell mission to northern Newfoundland and Labrador elucidates the way in which a female artist, crafter, and healthcare practitioner mobilized her skill set for a gendered form of social, mental, physical, and economic healing. As I proceed in this research, both on my own as part of a larger collective, I seek to continue analyzing these crafted objects and mapping the theoretical and geographical links of occupational therapy and arts and crafts revivalism as they were deployed during the early 20th century in Newfoundland and Labrador and the northeastern United States. Such links, I argue, offer new and different ways to understand the roles and histories of gendered cultural objects and women, cultural practitioners, working within the field of art and craft in Canada and beyond. Thank you very much.